Okay, hello everyone, and thanks for taking the time out to join us today. I'm pretty comfortable that these three panelists will make your effort worthwhile. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeff Kubiak. I'm a senior fellow at ASU's Center on the Future of War, professor of practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies, and I co-direct ASU's Online M.A. in Global Security, the MAGS. The rapid arrival of new technology is almost dizzying and can leave us somewhat unmoored when it comes to assessing its impact on security. The three scholars we've brought together today, all professors of practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies, and all who teach courses in the MA in Global Security, will help us at least find starting points for our analysis. I'm going to ask each of them to spend 8 to 10 minutes to give us their sense of where technology is and where it's headed, in some cases with regards to very specific technologies, and how it will shape the security environment. If you have any questions at any time, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll collect them for the Q&A session afterwards. And after that, we'll get started from there. Okay, so I'm gonna do some short introductions of all three of the speakers, and then I'll hand off the mic to each of the speakers individually. But first to speak, though, is going to be Annika Benendijk. Annika, in addition to teaching the Emerging Tech and Security course in the MAGS, Professor Benendijk is a political scientist at RAND Corporations, researching and writing on the future of military technologies, national security decision-making, civilian contributions to national resilience and resistance, gray zone conflict, and evolving dimensions of great power competition. She previously served in several positions in the Obama administration, in the State Department, the NSC staff, and the DoD, advising on a range of issues from Russia and Ukraine to the Middle East and NATO. Next is retired Marine Corps Lieutenant General Robert Schmidle. Professor Schmidle built and teaches 2 of the MAG cybersecurity concentration courses. He is ASU's University Advisor on cyber capabilities and conflict studies, and is a senior fellow at the Center on the Future of War as well. While on active duty, Professor Schmidle served as the first deputy commander of the United States Cyber Command, responsible for standing up the command while concurrently executing full spectrum cyber operations. Subsequently, he was the head of the Marine Corps Aviation, and his final assignment was on active duty was as Principal Deputy Director, Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And finally, Peter W. Singer has also built and teaches MAGS cybersecurity courses and has assisted in the development of other MAGS courses as well. Among a host of other things he does, Professor Singer is a strategist and senior fellow at New America. He's the author of some of the most influential books available on the topic of technology and security, to include books that very much shaped my understanding of technology and security, which include Wired for War, Cybersecurity and Cyber War, and Like War. He and his colleague August Cole have also explored the technology security intersection through fiction in their highly acclaimed novels, Ghost Fleet and Burn In. Okay, let's begin the conversation with Professor Benendijk.
Well, thanks so much, Jeff. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. As some of you may know, this was my first term teaching at MAGS, a course on emerging technology and global security. So it left me enthusiastic about speaking with you all today on this topic. One of the things that we discussed in the course this term was the fact that sort of looking at the nature of this most recent technological revolution and the reason it may have so much turbulence for global security. And one of the themes that really emerged was the fact that it's really the combination of various technologies from this most recent wave, as well as other areas of scientific innovation that will make the most impact. So, for example, biotechnology and AI or nanotechnology, and how they interact with one another. And some examples are, for example, mobile supercomputing or intelligent robots, self-driving cars, use of AI for supercomputing or genetic editing, and an area that's near and dear to my heart, neurotechnological brain enhancements, for example, that might allow us to engage more directly with machines. One of the other themes we explored in this course is this idea that some technological innovations may have security implications and applications that can go well beyond what might have been originally anticipated. And in other cases, of course, governments or other entities may fund early stage research in a particular technology that could have security implications. And so what I wanted to do today is to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've published recently in my other capacity as a political scientist at the RAND Corporation. And this is work that digs a bit into one particular emerging technology, brain-computer interface technology, that is one of these technologies that's sort of at the nexus of a number of different areas of innovation. And to think a little bit about the technology's implications from a security lens, from an ethical, an operational, and a policy standpoint. And I think it provides one illustrative example of an approach we can take to think systematically about how a technology that may not come to mature for even another decade or two might be applied within a security or military context, and what some of the associated risks and opportunities might be. So just to get the definition straight, brain-computer interface technology is a technology that allows for a direct communication pathway between a human brain and an external device or machine. So this might include an enhanced human brain and a bidirectional flow between the external machine and the brain. So as someone who is a national security expert and not a neuroscientist, one of the first things that I did along with my partner in the study was to look at the publicly available information on US Department of Defense programs related to BCI. While we didn't come up with exact figures, we did find that the US Department of Defense had invested hundreds of millions of dollars in translating neuroscience into neurotechnologies. Now, much of the military research in this area has been driven by therapeutic applications. So for example, prosthetic limbs for wounded warriors that respond directly to brain signals, or improved short-term memory for those who have sustained brain injuries in combat. But as we reviewed the various public programs and calls for research, we found that some neurotechnological work might theoretically support operational military applications down the road. So for example, the Army Research Lab has funded work on AI systems that can predict whether drivers are drowsy using EEG data. And this could have applications, for example, in a military convoy. DARPA's work has allowed a quadriplegic to fly an F-35 simulator through electrodes implanted in her brain. And even here at ASU, researchers that were funded in part by DARPA were able a few years ago to move drone swarms using only human thought, wearing external caps that sensed their neural electrical activity. And so as we thought about this emerging and fascinating area of technology, we really wanted our study to focus on a couple of concrete questions, and essentially whether BCI might be useful at all for future combat, and how, and then what risks or vulnerabilities this use might entail. So we started out by looking at current research and development on BCI and talked with some experts in the field about where the technology might be headed. We also considered the likely elements of the future military operational environment. And I have to say that my now colleague, Peter W. Singer here, shared a nice lunch and offered me some excellent insights and advice on project design, which I am still grateful for. But in terms of looking ahead at the future military operational environment, we talked about some of the things that Peter writes about in his books, the need for faster decision-making due to the increased use of artificial intelligence, the fact that there will be larger amounts of data to process, both at the tactical level for individual warfighters, as well as for decision makers higher up on the chain of command. And then the need for improved human-machine teaming, including with semi-autonomous systems that could allow a human in, or at least on, the decision-making loop. And we distilled these themes into, as well as the state of the art within the technology, into what we called a BCI, brain-computer interface toolbox, which were 7 capabilities that we thought might reasonably be available to the US warfighter over the coming decades. And we characterized these tools by what we figured they could achieve: human-machine decision-making, human-machine direct system control. So that's, think of the ASU program where you're directing swarms, for example, with your brain waves. Brain-to-brain communication, so synthetic telepathy, monitoring of human performance. That's the example of figuring out cognitive fatigue and overload, enhancement of cognitive performance, enhancement of physical performance, perhaps through interaction with an exoskeleton or some other device that would strengthen physical performance, and then in a training capacity. And we needed a way to understand whether and how these 7 capabilities might be used in future operations. So we convened a group of neuroscientists, military technology experts, and former military operators for a day-long war game at RAND. And we asked them to work together to think about what BCI capabilities would be useful to conduct a range of warfighter functions during 2 urban combat missions. And we also included a red team to explore how an adversary might exploit these technologies. And so looking at this binary question, would this capability be useful or desirable at all? This is a really part of a bigger question. And it was really important for this project because in our initial conversations with former military operators, a number we had talked to early in the project were really skeptical about the technologies used during combat. A friend, for example, who had served in the Battle of Fallujah asked why on earth the United States would consider investing in this exquisite technology during urban combat when what really might be needed is a good flamethrower. So we really looked hard at that sort of first principle, like utility. And our initial game results did indicate that yes, BCI could have tangible value in future combat. Our players had to choose, we gave them poker chips, and they had to choose between a BCI and a non-BCI option. And they did choose to use BCI capabilities for tasks across all of the warfighter functions, and explain specifically how they would use and apply these tools. Just as an example, from our toolbox, participants prioritized 3 BCI capabilities as particularly useful in our 2 urban combat scenarios. One was human-machine decision-making, which they thought could help to process information from many sources during a chaotic ambush to help make faster and more accurate decisions. A second was direct system control that would allow for hands-free and immediate control of machines during combat, for example, to operate drone swarms for close air support. And the third was the enhanced physical performance that would allow their team to see better, hear better, or more fluidly control an exoskeleton during the fight. And our participants also concluded that a fourth tool, this direct brain-to-brain communication among service members, could be perhaps the most revolutionary, even though it may be farthest afield from a technological perspective, in allowing a team to coordinate their actions while clearing a building, for example. Now, one important point our participants emphasized is that the fidelity and the reliability of any particular technological tool will determine how useful it was in combat. So in our case, the brain-to-brain tool that can convey very complex thoughts might be more useful than more rudimentary communication. We also explored the potential risks associated with the development and application of BCI in combat. And our red team helped a great deal with this. They were a devious bunch. So operationally, what if an adversary jams a BCI device, which may be more vulnerable because it relies on the brain's electrical signals? What if an adversary hacks a BCI device? They could have access to new information, to the emotional or cognitive states of service members. They could also potentially inflict brain injuries. We've seen US government employees in China and Cuba and elsewhere after auditory attacks. And imagine how much worse this could be if an adversary had direct access to their brains. And this sort of made the case, which I think is relevant for other emerging technologies as well, on the need for sort of redundancy when you're careful not to rely too heavily on a new and emerging technology just because it's there. Institutionally, we sort of thought about, the group thought about the fact, is it good or bad to have your boss in your brain? Maybe it's good if you're about to get shot from behind, but it can also lead to micromanagement as more senior officers have direct access, for example, to enlisted service members. And do you really want your superior officer, your colleagues to know your cognitive and emotional state? But what if you're scared? What if you're hangry? What if you're skeptical about the wisdom of a leader's decision? And as you might imagine, this could all have implications for unit cohesion, unit leadership, ultimately recruitment and retention, because if people don't trust the technology or how it'll be used, and particularly one is sensitive as neurotechnology, they may not want to join or stay in the armed services. And this led into some of our ethical and legal considerations. We did identify some new US government responsibilities that would apply to the US government, to BCI operators in the military, including health and safety considerations for both invasive and non-invasive BCI, a whole new range of privacy issues, and lots of new rules for veterans affairs. I think this is one thing that, particularly biotechnologies, that you have to think about sort of the lifetime of a service member even after they've left, and that's a responsibility that the U.S. government would continue to have. We also considered the laws of war, and this will be something that my colleagues discuss in more detail, but the responsibilities of a BCI operator during combat, and what happens, for example, if a human machine team making joint decisions through BCI commits a war crime. And Peter, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that in a little minute. So, we came up with a few recommendations. I think all things being equal, we recommended that the United States continue to pursue research and development into BCI capabilities in light of its potential use for future military operations, to collaborate or build on private sector and academic work that's already underway, and to consider a role for BCI in the development of other technologies, whether it's control of drone swarms, exoskeletons, oversight of semi-autonomous systems, to think about how it might best be integrated. I think the bottom line from our, it's really important to develop capabilities that are useful and not just using technologies for technology's sake. And so one way that we started this process was through gaming and exercises, and providing one methodology to do this that might be built on for other applications. And so we would argue that the US and others should use gaming and exercises to test for risks and vulnerabilities. And more broadly, that the USG, the Department of Defense, and other security agencies think really proactively about policies and regulation of BCI in this case, but emerging technologies more broadly. I think this will likely come up in the next discussion, but the technology, the discussion on artificial intelligence now is more mature, but it was really, I think we have an opportunity with BCI to get ahead of the game and to have a robust discussion even before the technology is in the field. So with that, I'd like to conclude and to pass the baton to my esteemed colleagues.
Great. Thank you, Professor Benedek. I appreciate that, and we all do. And next up will be Professor and General Robert Schmidle. Bob?
I'm trying. Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. All right. Well, thanks. That was a great discussion, Annika. That very, very helpful. What I would suggest we might think about as we start the discussion, I'm going to transition the discussion into the world of the interaction between humans and non-human agents, right? And we're going to bring in the world of AI into the human ethical and moral decision-making process. But I think the thing to think about before we start that is there's many different levels at which technology interfaces in the world of conflict and in the future of war. There's the interface that technology has at the tactical level, right? And at that level, we're talking about trying to enhance the performance of soldiers or Marines that are in urban combat. We're trying to enhance the performance of drones, et cetera. And we're trying to make decisions quicker and faster, right? So you've all probably heard of this OODA loop that to observe, orient, decide, and act. And it's just a way of thinking about making decisions. But I would suggest that while that works very well at the tactical level, it doesn't work so well at the strategic level. And at the strategic level is where we, historically, the United States, and especially the United States military, that's where we haven't enjoyed the same level of success that we have at the tactical level. So the thing that we're struggling with here is tactical actions that contribute to the strategic end state. We are very good at tactical actions, and you can continue to observe that beginning when this country was first formed, all the way up until our most recent forays into Iraq and Afghanistan. So understanding what we're doing at the tactical level, at the boots on the ground level, and how that impacts the strategy or the end state that the senior political leaders have set, that confluence is still, I would suggest, it still eludes us. And so when we talk about the application of technology, it's important that I think that we realize that there is a distinction between those two areas. Here's an example. In the beginning in the First World War, for example, the technology that was among the most disruptive, there were a number of them, airplanes, but the one that I want to focus on now is the submarine. And it was disruptive in a very strong moral and ethical sense, because prior to the advent of a submarine, if you were on a surface ship and you were wanting to board or raid a ship of another country that you were at war with, you would sail up to them, you would give them all kinds of warnings, they would put all the people that are on the ship that were not combatants off into lifeboats, and then you would sink the ship or tie it up and drag it into port or whatever. Well, a submarine can't do that, right? And when it surfaces, it's extremely vulnerable. So what you began to see was this fits and starts of unrestricted submarine warfare, where submarines were torpedoing merchant ships without any warning, because they had justified the way that they were operating based on the fact that the submarine could not survive. So there's a tactical level action, a submarine, right, a tactical technology that very quickly had very large and considerable influence on the moral and ethical thoughts of and policies that were being made at the highest levels, whether or not, for example, to engage in unrestricted submarine warfare. When the Germans did that, it among other things, it's eventually going to bring the United States into the war, which, in spite of the tactical victories that Germany may have enjoyed, strategically they were going to lose the war because of the alliance that was formed against them based on the United States. If you go into the Second World War, you find that the British began to use bombers at night, and at night they were very inaccurate. So the tactics became, we're going to bomb population centers in the hope that the effect is that it's going to break the back of the German population to be able to resist, and that they're all going to want to surrender. Well, the exact opposite happened. It actually sort of stiffened the spine of the German civilians. It also, during that period of time, the Germans were manufacturing more fighters than they had prior to that bombing. And the third thing that happens is there's a sense of sort of moral revulsion on the part of the British population when they realized that what the bombers were doing at night was unrestricted bombing of civilian casualties. And the air marshal that was in charge of that is the only senior officer in the British Armed Forces at the end of the Second World War that does not have a statue. So you can see how when you start to ramp these technologies up, you get to a point where they affect the way the strategy, the way the upper level of the government looks at what it is we're trying to accomplish in this war. All right. So when you think about the technologies, I would just invite you to just raise your view up a little bit from the technologies at the tactical level that are the most, in many cases, the most clearly articulated capabilities, and begin to think more about the implications above that level. A couple of other things to think about is, so let's talk for a minute about the development of AI. And there are many thoughts on this that based on it's not going to matter to, it's going to change the world. Well, let's just talk about some of the implications of emergence, of an AI's ability to understand emergent behaviors and to identify emergence. So right now we are in the kind of the grip of what a lot of the academics refer to as second wave AI, where it's a lot of data processing, it's mining of data. When we get into the third wave, if you will, of AI, that's when AI is going to begin to understand emergence and to begin to predict emergent behaviors in other systems. If we look at ourselves as a system, if the system is not, it's not a human and it's not an AI, it's a combination of the two. If we look at ourselves and the technology together, I think that that's going to give us a useful way to begin to understand what will happen when the AI begins to display to us humans what it believes to be emergent behavior that it sees in another system that is also a combination of human and AI. And so what does that mean? What it means is that if you could understand emergence in that way, and you could see into the future, if you will, of the kinds of behaviors, it would cause you at a tactical level to begin to focus more on the future battles and less on the ones that you're fighting right now. Because you would understand, you would begin to get some insight into what the implications are of the current fight for the future. Now, what does that mean? It means that we would, in the operations centers now, would shift the focus of effort. And I can see a day coming where the focus of effort will be almost entirely on the future and not so much on the current operations as it occurs today. Important to remember too, that every time a new technology has been introduced, whether it's been the machine gun or with the one very big exception of a nuclear weapon, that technology we've always found a way around it. There's always been another technology. It's never been the quote war-winning thing that it was proposed to be, something that was going to change the nature or the character of warfare. So I would leave you with one last thing to think about here. Imagine if you had an AI, and Annika alluded to this a minute ago. So imagine, if you will, in a command center. So let's drive this down to the tactical level for a second. If you had an AI or a series of AIs that were part of a command center that were interfacing with humans as an equal partner, as opposed to something that was pushing information to a human to make a decision. That fundamental model, I think, is where we have been, not where we ought to be going. So if the AI, let's say that it was mining, it was looking into all of the data that was in this operations center and everywhere else, and the AI began to see what it thought was the potential for a war crime that was occurring at one of the units that was out in the field. How do we deal with that? Do we empower the AI to give an order to stop it? Do we tell the AI to tell a human decision maker that something bad is going to happen and here's why? That assumes then that an AI would understand causality. It would understand what causes things to happen. And the more human-like it becomes, the more likely it is to be so human that it can make the wrong decision. And understanding how we're going to deal with that is also something that, as we go forward, that we ought to be thinking about. And lastly, if you take that example and you bring it up to the strategic level, and you have an AI that is looking exclusively at a combatant or at a belligerent enemy, the enemy of whatever country you are, and analyzing the way that those senior leaders are thinking and the actions that they're performing, at what point do you begin to trust the AI to the extent that you are going to make other decisions based on what it sees as the potential for emergence in the future behaviors of those other countries' statesmen? So just again, to come full circle on this, I would just ask you to think about the strategic implications of what's happening at the tactical level, and not focus solely on that technology, but ask yourself the question, if I could do this, how would that affect the way that I might think about actually fighting this war, or actually engaging in this conflict?
Great. Thank you, Professor Schmidle. Excellent. All right, next we'll ask Peter Singer. I know, Peter, you have some slides too. Peter.
Well, I wanted to add in my thanks to everyone at Arizona State and Jeff for hosting this session, and also just organizing the overall MAGS program. It's just been a fantastic program to participate in, and just really great experience with the faculty and the students the last couple of years. So I was asked to speak to the overall sense of change in technology and national security. And as I'm going, getting my slide deck here, the issue when we're trying to wrestle with the future of technology and national security, and particularly the challenge of what are those strategic surprises that await us, is that it's often portrayed as a kind of black swan, that it's some kind of unimaginable that awaits us, when in reality, the problem is usually akin to the gray rhino. It's something that's big, obvious, staring us in the face. It's just really uncomfortable for us to look at and admit that it's in the room with us. That is the consistent pattern of when we get things wrong. Not that it was unimaginable, but it was just staring us in the face. We just didn't want to admit it. And when I think about the arcs of change out there, and you've heard this touched on by my colleagues, I would say, look, it's rather obvious. It's the changes going on in artificial intelligence right now. I mean, we are living through, let's admit it, one of the most important moments, not just in technology, but all of human history. We have something that we've talked about and imagined for literally thousands of years coming true in our lifetime. You can find discussions of the equivalent of artificial intelligence and increasingly autonomous robotics and everything from ancient Greek mythology to old Judaic texts to, if you want to move forward, we've been wrestling with it in science fiction for well over 100 years. And so it's finally happening. Now, I don't think I'm going out on a limb by saying that, saying, look, this is an incredibly important change that's going on around us. You can see it also wrestled with everything from organizations, military services, to you even see it in individual leader attitudes. There was one survey that was taken that found that 91% of leaders say that they believe that AI is the most important game-changing technology out there. So it would seem like, okay, we get it, we're ready, except I would say no. And I love the parallel that General Schmidl talked about of looking back in time. And I think that period of the interwar years is very instructive because in many ways, I think we're akin to, say, the battleship captains of the 1930s. We've moved from denying that airplanes matter, which was, how they talked about it in the immediate wake of World War I, to they would then, by the 1930s, wag their fingers and say, don't you tell me that I'm not ready for the future. In fact, I'm so ready for the future. I'm giving up both valuable deck space and valuable budget for airplanes. I'm ready for them. The reason why is airplanes are going to make my battleship more lethal than it's ever been before. They're going to allow my battleship to sight the enemy fleet at a greater distance, aim my cannon better. So I am ready for this new technology. Basically, they were embracing change just enough not to change. Or a similar parallel is here with the machine gun. This is a US Army training exercise in 1931. So we've seen the machine gun used in World War I to such devastating effect. And yet, well over a decade afterward, we still have this sort of, okay, machine gun, it's a really big deal. So I'm going to mount it on the back of my horse-drawn wagon. I am layering it on top of what I already do, what I already think now. I'm embracing change just enough not to change. So when we look at what's going on out there with not just the software of AI, but also its implications for the hardware side, you can see changes in everything from robotic forms and numbers. It's, of course, not just us that's utilizing this, but a wide range of potential adversaries. It also, though, opens up areas in terms of new threats. When we think about the software and how increasingly the internet is no longer about communication between humans, but operation between things and these increasingly intelligent things. And as we've talked about in the cybersecurity courses, as the students that work with me know, you see coming out of that both a growth in the attack surface that adversaries can go after with literally billions more points to target. But even more important than that, you see a different type of threat where you can use digital means to cause physical change in the world, physical damage. And this is something that, as Jeff referenced, we've wrestled with in both our nonfiction and our fiction in the Burn-In project. Now, what does this all mean? I would say in many ways, it leads to a massive rethink of the battlefield and security. You know, everything from new technologies to new tactics to new doctrines and all that that means for organizations. Now, it's pretty bold to say that, but why should we think that AI and robotics are going to be somehow less in their effect than, say, machine guns in 1914 or the airplane and the tank in 1939? Shouldn't they be more, given that they're a technology that is different than all prior technology, as you've heard of from my colleagues, and that it is increasingly intelligent, ever improving, ever more dependent? So it is a very different kind of technological change. And that leads to very different needs for education as we think about the world moving from two-dimensional to multi-dimensional moves, for example, on the battlefield. It leads to a very different pace of not just battlefield decisions, but conflict overall, whether you're looking at cyber warfare or missile defense. You basically see the OODA loop becoming more and more digital and moving at digital speed. But it also may yield conflicts to slow down, so to speak, or rather never really end. This is a display of Russia's cyber activities against Ukraine during their conflict. And what was notable about it is much of it took place before the first little green man ever crossed the border. So the cyber conflict that mattered the most is what happened before the actual conflict ever began. And of course, as you've heard from my colleagues, it's also yielding all sorts of new questions of ethics and law. And importantly, each of these are playing out, not just in warfare, they're playing out on our highways right now. You know, if you want to say, well, what if a robot killed a person? Well, sorry, that's already happened on our streets, and we're wrestling with the gap in the law around that. So I think one final thing that I'd throw out there is that we also need to recognize that it's about a larger effect, not just on the battlefield, but overall on society. We think about the Industrial Revolution that robotics hold. So here again, I'm going to end on this point by saying it's not just, shouldn't it have a greater effect than the submarine or the machine gun? We're talking about the equivalent of the steam engine or the computer. And so with that, I very much appreciate y'all joining and look forward to your questions.
Great. It sounds like you have some company in your room as well, Peter.
A dog outside has decided to agree with me vociferously.
Okay, fantastic. Hey, okay, so if the rest of the panelists, the other two panelists, have turned their cameras back on, we'll do a little Q&A. I kind of like to take the opportunity to present the first question. Where did Peter and Bob? The students in my 501 class spent a little bit of time studying the Battle of Königgrätz in 1866. The Prussians and the Austrians both had access to roughly the same technologies over the course of the same period of time. But the Prussians were that much more effective in actually using it to do something different, to amass firepower differently, to split forces differently, to do those sorts of things that for some reason the Austrians would not do. Austrians didn't use that technology the same way. And it was a pretty resounding defeat for the Austrians in that situation. The question is, in today's global security environment, is the US Austria or Prussia in the case of the way we're approaching technology and employing it to achieve outcomes and to secure the country? And I think Maybe Bob, you can start with that because you have the strategic outlook and you kind of brought that topic up yourself in your own talk.
So I think that what we would want to look at first is the result. What was it that the two belligerents were trying to achieve? And in the day and age when that battle occurred, it was the way that wars were fought and the way that they ended was there was more general agreement among the belligerents that if you defeated an army, you had won the day, right? And and this is actually, Clausewitz is, as much as we use him to try to justify this, was actually somebody that he was chipping away at that conventional wisdom. That just because the armies win on the battlefield doesn't mean that it is the case. And I think if you look at where we are today, and even though people like to look at the Second World War and say, well, that was the good war, well, I don't know. Let's think about how it ended, right? And when it ended, with the Soviet Union occupying more than a third of Europe. So I think that the technology that winning or losing at the tactical level is something that we need to reconsider in light of what it is we're trying to do strategically. There's the very famous quote, which is applicable again. There was an Army colonel named Harry Summers that wrote a book shortly after the Vietnam War, and it was called On Strategy, and it was his takeoff on War, on Clausewitz's tome. And Summers contended in this book that the U.S. Army had not lost Vietnam, but and this is where a lot of the mythology begins to develop, that it was the politicians that lost the war, not the Army. And so fast forward to the early 80s, and Summers is going to go on the very first of the missions, if you will, to open up the dialogue with the North Vietnamese, who have now occupied all of Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. And he has a conversation with General Giap. General Giap was the architect of the North Vietnamese military success, if you will. And Summers says to him, to Giap in this conclave of a dozen people or so that witnessed this, he said, you never beat us, the Americans, on the battlefield. And Giap looked at Summers and said, Colonel, you are exactly right, and that is completely irrelevant. And I don't think that the U.S. military has a deep enough understanding of what was just said. So the technology, again, my focus on this is, and my hope is that we will look beyond what it does to us in terms of a tactical success on the battlefield to how that technology is going to help us to achieve the strategic end states, and or to challenge the leadership that has developed those strategic end states, if they are in fact incoherent. So I think your point is well taken, but I think we need to take it in the context of what a battlefield victory meant between the Prussians and the Austrians in terms of their national security, and what it means today, where you can lose a lot of battles and still, quote, win the war.
That's an interesting point, and I think, Peter, your book Ghost Fleet sort of touches on that, right? In terms of the competitive view of technology, the relationship between the U.S. and China, at least in the case of that book, or U.S., China, and Russia. What is your take on that? Is there, are we spending a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of effort to enter this arms race in competitive great power competition sort of mentality? And if so, are we doing it correctly?
I'd throw three things out there in terms of answering you. The first is there's this narrative that's emerged recently. A former Trump administration official did sort of a flamethrower resignation out of the Defense Department and said, we've already lost to China in AI. And it was a very kind of, to put it blunt, self-serving resignation letter about how he'd done everything perfect and no one else would listen to him. I can see Bob Schmidl smiling at it. But look, as someone who wrestles with the future, the easiest answer to that is, it's too early to predict that. How can you say we've already lost something 15 years out? I think really China is a much different and more challenging strategic and technology competitor than the Soviet Union was, because of everything from they're able to develop their own technology in a wider variety of areas to they're able to tap into the global market in a way that the Soviets never could. But come on, it's too early to make these kind of like, oh, we've already lost. Second issue, one of the determinants, and I think what you're hearing from all of us is not just history shows how much or how good your technology is, it's how you bring it all together. It's your doctrine, it's your organization. And that's, as you were putting it, that's one of the lessons out of that, whether it's looking at the 1800s or you want to look, back at Alexander the Great or whatnot. And I would say a worry for me is that there are alternative doctrines and using some of these new technologies that maybe turn out to be better than the track that we're on. We don't yet know, but as an example, much of recent Chinese military thinking, for example, in PLA Daily, People's Liberation Army Daily, they've talked about the quote, the translation is the new concepts of war. And one of the interesting things out of their officers, two strategists in China at least, predict that the future of war is going to be the quote, small but many defeating the big but few. And their reference is everything. They mean the small but many and everything from robotics to electronic warfare to cyber warfare. And they, of course, believe that we have an approach, whether it's our warships, whether it's our tanks, whether it's our overall strategic thinking that's on the big but few side. So, are there alternative doctrines that maybe we ought to be exploring? But then the final thing I'd throw out there, which is an interesting one, is the real secret sauce for the Prussians at that battle that you mentioned was not their weapons. It was that they had they'd created their general staff. They'd organized a certain way of training and using their officers. And I was at, actually, I was teaching a class of a group of US military officers, and one of them referenced, there's all this different change going on, but of course, we found coming out of the Prussians, the right way to organize and train our staff. And I was like, they found the right way for the 1800s and 1900s. Are you certain it's the right way for the 21st century?
Right, that's a good point. And actually, it went way beyond that too. And you're mentioning too, with regards to expanding our understanding of what conflict is in the contemporary technological era, right? Because our education system, the way they even built the railroads in a commercial and military fashion, it was all kind of cohesive and much more kind of broadly considered than anybody had been doing at the time, which is part and parcel to that Prussian success as well. Annika, did you have something you want to add on that, or I've got some other questions we can wheel at you. Oh, hang on, sorry, I probably have to unmute you here. Sorry.
Just very briefly, I think certainly in the work I've done, I think that this and in our class as well. I mean, the as Peter said, the use of doctrine, organizational change. I mean, this is why we looked at sort of unit cohesion, recruitment, retention, and all these things. I think just to add to Peter's remarks, I mean, it takes a certain amount of imagination to kind of get beyond this mentality and to sort of take the next leap. And we do have in the United States, we have the Defense Innovation Board. We have a dedicated JAIC, the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. There are these sort of institutional nodes for thinking about these issues and implementing them. But one, it may take a little bit more creativity, and it's works like, Peter's and August Cole's, it's initiatives like the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab effort to harness science fiction, to think beyond a little bit, that may nudge people to take that imaginative leap to create the doctrine and the organizational change that's going to be required in order to fully implement the technological innovation.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Annika. And I like your pitch of Peter's book too, because actually Peter and August's book, because I think that's right. And I think there's a real bright future for that. And I know Peter is kind of banking on that at some level. So a couple of questions from the participants that I want to throw out here to make sure everybody gets their say here. One of the participants asked, audience members asked, how would AI discriminate tactical ambiguity versus truth if bad actors perhaps learn to cope with how AI predicts emergence. Say AI battling battling AI through human movement. It's not. So how would you discriminate tactical ambiguity versus truth if bad actors perhaps learn to cope with AI, perhaps AI predicts emergence? I'm not sure. I think maybe, Bob, you got some ideas on that one? I did already. Go.
Oh, okay. Yeah, see, this is an example of centralized command and control that will not work in the future. So you have one person that controls the muting and unmuting of the panelists. So, and Jeff's doing a phenomenally good job, but he's not very good at predicting the emergence of our questions and our comments. So, but he'll get there. So I think if you're trying to understand how an enemy copes with the notion that AI is predicting emergence, right? So let's unpack that for a minute. First of all, you, the person that's asking a question, you have made an assumption that there is some verifiable, quantifiable truth that is out there that describes exactly what's happening in a tactical situation at a given time on the ground. And anybody that's been in those situations will tell you that that's probably not the most accurate way to describe that. There's a reason that from the time you're a lieutenant in any of the services, you are taught that first reports are always wrong. And it's a very rapidly emerging perspective. If the AI is looking at an enemy and predicting emergence, and you are the enemy, then you need to be able to explain how you are going to understand your own emergent behavior. Back when we stood up the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, I was a colonel in charge of the Special Purpose MAGTF, which was the organization. It was about 1,500 Marines, and we conducted all of the major warfighting experiments over the course of 3 years. And one of the last things that I did there was to bring the folks at California Polytechnic Institute under contract to create expert agents, AI, if you will, to help us try to understand the implications inside a command center. And one of the agents they had there, I asked them to look at me, the commander, and tell me when I was beginning to exhibit emergence. I was beginning to exhibit behavior that I had not been exhibiting before. Technically, we couldn't get there from here in 1999, but that's what we were trying to do. So your comment about that, I think the question is a good one, and it's one that we ought to think some more about, but we ought to be thinking about how, if we are trying to determine emergence in an enemy, how that enemy is trying to determine emergence in us, and whether or not the sort of wetware that we have between our ears is going to, how we're going to compete, if you will, with an AI, which is why I made the proposition earlier that we ought to be thinking about AI and humans together as a single entity, not as two separate things. And the points that Annika and Peter brought up before about emergence, or about innovation rather, is exactly what the department is struggling with now. We have organizations that are charged, like Mike Rowan and the folks in the JAIC, with looking at AI, and the Defense Innovation Unit, which is trying to look at innovative technologies. But all those things are only useful and valuable in the context of something that they're trying to do to get people to understand the implications. So I would just encourage us to tighten that loop up a little bit. And Jeff, I think you're doing an absolutely marvelous job of muting and unmuting all of us here on the panel. Just, I want to be on the record.
Oh yeah, nicely done, Bob. Thanks. That's an interesting point though, Bob, that you made, and I think actually ties together all three of the panelists into this conversation. I think it's really interesting. We got a question over here. I think that actually fits, Bob, into kind of your talking. And Annika, you would have some insight into this as well, and Peter probably too. The audience member says, we have talked about a few examples of JAIC, DIB, Army Futures Command, et cetera, as examples of where DoD senior leaders address the technology gaps. These are relatively big efforts with significant resources behind them. So I do not think the problem is DoD leadership not understanding the importance of emerging technologies. I don't think the Austrians did either, quite frankly. The problem seems to be organizational structure of the DoD. What could the DoD do to address these organizational/cultural problems? Peter, you mentioned something about basically just expanding the whole concept of conflict beyond what maybe would be considered in the DoD realm. Is that kind of where you would head with that, or do you think there's something specific within a DoD that could be done?
Oh gosh, I was hoping you were going to go to Annika first on that one. It's a really tough question. One thing to note, though, in terms of their question, is that I find fascinating. I do these leader training courses for both the most senior leaders, the congratulations, you're now a 4-star general and you've got to go to a couple of weeks of executive education, and I'll lecture them, to the mid-career types, the, congratulations, you're a colonel, and you go to the similar kind. And I speak to both of them. And what's so fascinating is the senior leaders will ask me, how do we get our organization, how do we get that mid-career, that program manager to, I want change, but I'm getting blocked by them. And then in turn, the colonels are always, how do we get the senior leaders to understand X, Y, and Z? So there's always this sort of, pointing the fingers at each other, which I think points to, a larger issue of org culture, bureaucracy, you name it. Look, you're not going to have a single solution to this. You need everything from altering your talent management. If you are trying to, bring in, whether it's, an entire new technology like AI and alter your doctrine and whatnot, and yet you're recruiting, training, promoting, evaluating people in the same exact way, then you're probably not going to achieve that change. Similarly, a large amount of what we describe as experimentation is really more about validation, proving that what we've already invested in was worth it, as opposed to really the 1930s style, the Fleet Marine exercises for Bob there, or the basically the Navy had similar versions ones, even the Army with the Louisiana maneuvers, where you're trying to discover an entire new approach. There's a lot that can be done. And again, I don't think you look for one single, you want to be constantly altering change. You also, I think, want to have as many of these ideas contests, whether it's the Shark Tank style from the bottom up, to the number 2 in the Pentagon recently created sort of a $30 billion fund that said, y'all want it, come to me with your best innovative ideas. And so it put some money on the table to force, kind of competition around it. Those are some ideas I would throw out there, but I'd love to hear from Annika on it.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm gonna give Annika. Annika, you saw the 5-sided puzzle palace from the inside with civilian clothes on, and we'll get to Bob, who saw it with 3 stars on his shoulders. So what's your take on the need for organizational changes?
Sure. I mean, I like this idea, Peter's note on the fund first. I mean, I think you have to, at some point you have to put money behind it, but it's cultural as well. I mean, having spent my late 20s and the better part of my mid 30s in the Pentagon and other parts of the bureaucracy, it can be a little stifling. And sort of how do you create that? How do you foster creativity within the constraints of that institution? And I think, competitions can be one. I think, I mean, the reason I mentioned the Marine Warfighters Laboratory is because it had, there were sort of encouraged writers to think creatively through different future operational scenarios. I think you have to have the meeting of operational expertise and the sort of creative juices. And I think one way to do that, which we've explored at RAND, is wargaming. And I know DoD has its own methods as well, but a really good game with a great, with a creative scenario can force people to make choices and to think through scenarios in a way that they might not, and to sort of take that mental leap. So I think there are ways to have people step out of their kind of bureaucratic roles and to foster that sort of innovative thinking. It's just a question of having the culture and the resources to support it.
Thank you. And Bob, your take from the inside with 3 buttons on your shoulder.
So So here's the issue. It's one thing to tell people to be innovative, and it's another thing to accept the fact that they're actually going to do something that you don't like or that you think is counterproductive. We used to have in the 90s when I went to the work college, everybody was encouraged to think out of the box. That was the expression at the time. And what always struck me as fanciful is that most of the people that were being told that had no idea what the box looked like to even understand how to think outside of it. A couple of quick things on program managers that Peter mentioned. So a program manager there's three things in his or her life that drive everything. It's called cost, schedule, and performance. And what every program manager wants is to be promoted, to be a general officer. And the only way to do that is to meet cost, schedule, and performance metrics that you have been assigned for that particular program. And those metrics generally have very little to do with the operational con-op that's going to be employed with that technology. I mean, there's a general purpose, big idea, but and in my experience at the Warfighting Lab and at Cybercom, when we were doing similar things with cyber, is that there's an iterative process between the technology and the concept development stage of it and the con-ops that has to be continuous, or you just won't get to where you want to go. On the experimentation piece, so there's two big ways to look at experimentation. There is discovery. I am doing this like the Louisiana maneuvers, like the Calibre experiments the Marine Corps did, like the Navy's wargaming / experimentation with War Plan Orange in the interwar years. That's to try to discover what it is that's out there that would be a better way to do this. That is very scary to seniors. And I found that I did not have a lot of support to do that when I was conducting these experiments. What I had a lot of support for was a thesis, if this, then that. And then, and as Peter articulated, then the experimentation becomes more of a demonstration or a validation of something that was sort of predetermined. The last piece on the wargaming, and I know what Kath Hicks is doing with the innovation piece. So Bob Work started this thing on wargaming, and he had a pot of money that the deputy kept out, and he was going to have everybody bring their big ideas to him. Well, what happened is that the services were only going to bring wargaming ideas that were going to end in a war game that was going to end in something that was going to look like you needed a bigger, faster Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marine Corps. So the cultures that you're dealing with, they determine exactly how fast the building is going to move. We remember the last thing I'll say, Peter Drucker's famous saying when asked about strategy, and he said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And trying to change the inner workings of the Pentagon without an understanding of the culture and incentivizing the services to do what you want them to do. Otherwise, they just wait you out for 3 or 4 years, and you hope that you have little pockets like in the Warfighting Lab in the Marine Corps or at AFWorks or wherever it happens to be, that they are eventually going to influence these things. But the influence on the programs, on the things that you need to do this, is what is difficult. The big mistake we made in the Warfighting Lab, in my opinion, is we separated ourselves intentionally from the entire acquisition process of the Marine Corps, because that was viewed as mired in 19th century think, and it was never going to get there. And so we ran real fast, and we did a bunch of stuff with O&M money and other sources of funding, but it took years longer than it should have, because the acquisition community threw up all the goddamn force shields and said, hey, doesn't meet our requirements. So there you have it.
Yeah.
So, but at any rate, that's just a little bit on that.
Great. Thank you all. I promised the panelists we'd stick to an hour. We're already past the 1 hour point. And I do deeply appreciate that the MAGS faculty as a whole is tremendous, but our professors of practice, especially those who have full-time jobs and spend time teaching our students, and engaging in events like this, are truly invaluable members of our MAGS team, and we all are very appreciative of your time and effort that you put into the success of our students and the MAGS community in general. So thank you to the three of you for joining us today. Thank you to the audience for showing up. It's been really nice to see such a nice turnout in the middle of the afternoon here in Arizona. Hopefully late afternoon, I guess, evening time, approaching evening time now in the East Coast, where our three panelists are residing. But I appreciate it again. We have more events coming in the future. Stay tuned to the Center on the Future of War and the MAGS campus site for more events. And a round of applause for the panelists. And we will see you next time. Thank you all.